Behind the towering walls of Topkapi Palace, where the Ottoman Empire ruled 3 continents for 6 centuries, lay secrets so shocking that they were hidden from the world for generations. This is the story of absolute power unchecked by moral boundaries, where sultans wielded life and death over millions while indulging in practices that would horrify even the most liberal modern minds. Welcome to the Imperial Harem, a world where thousands of women lived as prisoners of pleasure, where children were trained from infancy to serve the Sultan's every desire, and where the line between luxury and slavery disappeared entirely. This isn't just history. This is a journey into the darkest corners of human nature, where unlimited power created monsters who wore crowns and called themselves the shadow of God on earth. Picture Topkapi Palace in its prime. Over 400 rooms spread across 4 courtyards, home to 4,000 people whose entire existence revolved around serving one man's appetites. But the most important part of this vast complex was also the most hidden, the Imperial Harem. The harem wasn't just the Sultan's private quarters. It was a carefully designed prison that housed up to 1,000 women at any given time. These weren't wives in any meaningful sense. They were property, human collections acquired through conquest, purchase, or diplomatic gifts. The architecture itself tells the story. Windowless corridors that prevented escape. Guards who were deliberately castrated to eliminate any possibility of romantic rivalry. A hierarchy so complex that women would spend decades fighting for the chance to spend a single night in the Sultan's bed. But here's what makes this truly horrifying. This system wasn't an aberration or a temporary excess. It was the fundamental structure of Ottoman power for over 600 years, refined and perfected across generations of rulers who each added their own twisted innovations. The most disturbing aspect of the Ottoman system wasn't what happened to adult captives. It was what happened to children. The devshirme, or child levy, was a system that required Christian families throughout the empire to surrender their most beautiful and intelligent sons to serve the Sultan. These boys, some as young as 8 years old, were taken from their families forever and brought to the palace for a call and prayer training. Official histories describe this as education for government service. The reality was far more sinister. Many of these children were destined for the palace's most secretive roles, positions that required not just loyalty, but complete psychological submission to the Sultan's will. They were systematically broken down and rebuilt as extensions of imperial desire, their childhood identities erased and replaced with something that existed solely to serve power. The psychological manipulation was sophisticated and brutal. Children were isolated from their peers, subjected to rigorous discipline, and gradually introduced to palace life through a series of tests that identified those suitable for the Sultan's personal attention. Inside the harem, a parallel economy existed, based entirely on the Sultan's sexual preferences. Women were categorized, trained, and ranked according to their ability to satisfy specific desires. The most favored became favorites, a title that brought incredible luxury, but also terrible vulnerability. Consider the psychological horror of this system. Imagine being a teenage girl, taken from your family, unable to speak the language, forced to compete with hundreds of other women for the attention of a man who could order your execution without explanation. The training these women received went far beyond simple education in music, dance, and languages. Historical accounts describe elaborate preparations that taught women to anticipate and fulfill desires so specific, so extreme, that contemporary sources could only hint at them through euphemism and metaphor. But the most chilling aspect was the expendability of human life. Women who failed to please, who grew too old, or who simply fell out of favor could be disposed of with the same casual indifference as worn-out furniture. No sultan embodied the extremes of Ottoman imperial culture more than Suleiman I, known to history as the Magnificent. During his 46-year reign, he expanded the empire to its greatest extent while simultaneously pushing the palace's private practices to their most elaborate extremes. Suleiman's relationship with his favorite, Roxolana, scandalized the Ottoman court precisely because it suggested that a sultan might actually care about one woman's feelings. But even this famous love story had a dark side that reveals the twisted nature of imperial power. Roxalena's rise to influence required her to eliminate rivals through methods that combine seduction with assassination, manipulation with murder. The palace became a battlefield where women fought not just for love, but for survival itself. By the 16th century, the Ottoman harem had evolved into something unprecedented in human history, a self-sustaining ecosystem of exploitation that operated according to its own twisted logic. At its center was the Sultan, but surrounding him was a complex hierarchy of women, eunuchs, and servants whose relationships defied conventional understanding. The most powerful woman in the empire wasn't the Sultan's wife, it was his mother, the valid Sultan, who controlled access to her son and wielded power that rivaled that of the Grand Vizier himself. But this power came at a terrible price. These women had to watch their own sons become monsters, had to participate in a system that destroyed thousands of lives to maintain their position. Consider the psychological horror of motherhood in this context. The Valid Sultan knew that her son's power depended on his ability to inspire fear, to demonstrate that human life meant nothing to him. She had to encourage the very brutality that made her position possible. Every evening in the palace followed a ritual that exemplified the dehumanization at the heart of Ottoman imperial culture. The Sultan would be presented with a selection of women, sometimes a dozen, sometimes more, from which he would choose his companion for the night. This wasn't seduction or courtship, it was selection, like choosing fruit at a market. The women would be displayed according to precise protocols, their bodies examined, their appeal evaluated, their suitability for specific activities assessed by eunuchs, who recorded the Sultan's preferences in meticulous detail. Those not chosen faced a night of anxiety, wondering if their failure to attract attention meant their value was declining, their position becoming precarious. Those who were chosen faced different terrors. The pressure to perform, the knowledge that disappointment could mean exile or worse. But perhaps most disturbing was the systematic nature of this process. It wasn't driven by passion or even lust, but by a bureaucratic approach to pleasure that treated human sexuality as another aspect of imperial administration. Historical documents from the Ottoman archives reveal details about imperial preferences that challenge our understanding of the limits of human behavior. Sultans didn't just demand sexual satisfaction, they demanded entertainment that pushed boundaries in ways that seemed designed to demonstrate their power over basic human dignity. Some sultans required elaborate theatrical performances that combined elements of traditional Ottoman entertainment with activities that belonged more in the realm of public humiliation than private pleasure. Women were required to participate in scenarios that recreated historical events, religious ceremonies, or cultural traditions in ways that perverted their original meaning. The psychological impact on participants was devastating. Women who had once been daughters, sisters, and mothers found themselves forced to participate in activities that destroyed any connection to their former identities, that replaced their humanity with a kind of performing animality. The imperial harem wasn't just morally horrifying. It was economically devastating to the empire itself. By the 17th century, maintaining the palace's elaborate system of human trafficking was consuming enormous resources that could have been used for military expansion or economic development. Consider the mathematics of exploitation. Housing, feeding, clothing, and guarding 1,000 women required a massive infrastructure. Training eunuchs, maintaining security, providing medical care for sexually transmitted diseases, the costs were staggering, but the real economic cost was the loss of human potential. These weren't just random women. They were often the most intelligent, most beautiful, most talented women in the empire, removed from productive roles and reduced to objects of consumption. The irony is that the very system that symbolized Ottoman power was simultaneously weakening the empire's ability to compete with European rivals who were beginning to harness human potential more effectively. Ibrahim I who ruled from 1640 to 1648, represents the logical endpoint of a system that gave unlimited power to men who were psychologically unprepared to handle it. Contemporary accounts describe a ruler whose demands became so extreme, so divorced from reality, but even his own courtiers began to question whether absolute power had driven him completely insane. Ibrahim's obsessions weren't just numerous, they were specific in ways that revealed a mind that had lost all connection to normal human relationships. He demanded that his partners meet increasingly bizarre criteria, participate in elaborate rituals that combined religious ceremony with sexual performance, and submit to treatments that seemed designed more to demonstrate power than to provide pleasure. The harem, during Ibrahim's reign, became a kind of laboratory for exploring the limits of human degradation. Women were required to participate in experiments that tested their psychological breaking points, their willingness to abandon their humanity in service of imperial desire. The most horrifying example of Ottoman imperial brutality occurred during Ibrahim's reign, when rumors of infidelity in the harem led to one of history's most shocking mass executions. According to multiple historical sources, Ibrahim ordered that all 280 women in his harem be sewn into weighted sacks and thrown into the Bosphorus. Imagine the scene: hundreds of women, many of whom had served the Sultan faithfully for years, being led to their deaths not for any crime they had committed, but because their very existence had become inconvenient to imperial paranoia. The execution took place at night, in secret, with only the splash of bodies hitting water to mark the end of hundreds of lives. By morning, the harem was empty, and new women were already being selected to fill the vacant positions. This wasn't justice, or even revenge. It was the ultimate expression of power that had become completely divorced from humanity, that treated human life as infinitely disposable in service of maintaining absolute control. By the 18th century, the psychological damage inflicted by the Ottoman imperial system was becoming visible not just in the harem, but throughout the palace hierarchy. Eunuchs, who had spent decades facilitating imperial excess, showed signs of severe mental illness. Women, who survived multiple sultans, displayed behaviors that modern psychology would recognize as symptoms of severe trauma. The palace became a collection of broken people trying to maintain the fiction of imperial grandeur while dealing with the psychological consequences of their participation in systematic dehumanization. Suicide rates climbed. Violence between women increased. The very foundations of palace life began to crack under the weight of accumulated horror. Even the sultans themselves showed signs of the damage. Later Ottoman rulers displayed increasingly erratic behavior, unusual sexual obsessions, and a paranoia that suggested they understood, on some level, the monstrosity of the system they had inherited. The 19th century brought European influence and Ottoman reform movements that gradually dismantled the traditional harem system. But this wasn't driven by moral awakening, it was driven by practical necessity. The empire was losing wars, falling behind economically, and facing internal rebellions that threatened its very existence. Reformers like Mahmud II began to understand that the resources devoted to maintaining imperial excess could be better used for military modernization and economic development. The harem was gradually reduced in size, its practices constrained by new laws that reflected European standards of behavior. But the damage was already done. Centuries of systematic exploitation had created cultural patterns that would take generations to overcome. The empire that had once terrified Europe was now seen as the sick man of the continent, weakened not just by military defeats, but by the moral corruption that had eaten away at its foundations. What happened to the thousands of women who lived through the Ottoman harem system? Their stories, largely untold by traditional historians, reveal the human cost of imperial excess in ways that statistics cannot capture. Some women managed to gain enough influence to protect themselves and others, becoming power brokers who used their intimate knowledge of palace life to carve out spaces of relative safety. Others retreated into mental illness, their minds unable to process the contradiction between their humanity and their treatment as objects. The most tragic stories involve women who were retired from palace service as they aged, cast out into a world they no longer understood, with skills that had no application outside the artificial environment of the harem. Many became beggars, their former status as imperial favorites meaning nothing in the practical world beyond palace walls. The Ottoman imperial system didn't just affect those who lived within it, it created cultural patterns that influenced Turkish society for generations. The normalization of extreme gender inequality, the acceptance of violence as a tool of control, the idea that power justified any behavior, these concepts survived the fall of the empire itself. Modern scholars studying domestic violence, human trafficking, and sexual exploitation in former Ottoman territories often trace contemporary problems back to cultural patterns established during the imperial period. The idea that women exist primarily to serve male desires, that children can be treated as property, that power creates its own moral authority. These beliefs didn't disappear when the last sultan was deposed. The psychological damage extended beyond individual trauma to create intergenerational patterns of behavior that shaped family relationships, gender roles, and concepts of appropriate sexual conduct throughout the region. For over a century after the Ottoman Empire's collapse, historians and political leaders engaged in a systematic effort to minimize or misrepresent the realities of imperial court life. The harem was romanticized as a place of exotic luxury rather than systematic exploitation. Sultans were portrayed as enlightened rulers rather than sexual predators with unlimited power. This wasn't accidental. It was a deliberate attempt to create a usable past that could support modern Turkish national identity without confronting the moral implications of imperial history. Museums displayed palace artifacts without explaining their context. Tourism promoted the mystery and romance of Ottoman court life while ignoring its human cost. The result was a historical amnesia that prevented honest examination of how absolute power corrupts not just individuals, but entire civilizations. The lessons that could have been learned from Ottoman history were buried under layers of nationalist mythology and romantic fantasy. Only in recent decades have historians begun to confront the full reality of Ottoman imperial practices. Archival research, archaeological evidence, and comparative studies with other historical empires have revealed the systematic nature of exploitation within the palace system. This reckoning has been difficult and controversial. Nationalist historians argue that focusing on imperial excesses plays into Western stereotypes about Eastern despotism. Feminist scholars contend that minimizing the harem's brutality perpetuates the very attitudes that made such exploitation possible. But perhaps the most important aspect of this modern examination is what it reveals about the relationship between power and morality in all human societies. The Ottoman Sultans weren't uniquely evil. They were human beings, given unlimited power over other human beings, with predictably horrifying results. The story of the Ottoman harem serves as a warning about what happens when any individual or institution is given absolute authority without accountability. It reminds us that the capacity for systematic cruelty exists in all cultures, all time periods, whenever the powerful are allowed to treat the powerless as objects rather than human beings. As we confront modern forms of human trafficking, sexual exploitation, and abuse of power, the Ottoman example provides crucial insights into how such systems develop and sustain themselves. The gradual normalization of cruelty, the bureaucratization of exploitation, the use of luxury and privilege to mask fundamental injustice, these patterns repeat across cultures and centuries. Understanding the Ottoman imperial system isn't just about historical knowledge. It's about recognizing the warning signs of systematic dehumanization in our own time. When we see power being exercised without accountability, when we encounter systems that treat some people as inherently less valuable than others, when we observe the normalization of extreme inequality, these are the conditions that made the Ottoman harem possible. The thousands of women who suffered within that system deserve to be remembered not as exotic footnotes to imperial history, but as human beings whose experiences reveal fundamental truths about power, exploitation, and the human capacity for both cruelty and survival. Their stories remind us that behind every system of oppression are individual human beings whose lives matter, whose suffering demands acknowledgement, and whose experiences can teach us how to build better, more humane societies. The Ottoman Empire fell over a century ago, but the questions it raises about power, morality, and human dignity remain as relevant today as they were in the palace corridors of Topkapi. How do we prevent the concentration of power that makes such exploitation possible? How do we maintain our humanity in systems that encourage us to treat others as objects? How do we learn from history's darkest chapters without being paralyzed by their horror? These are the questions that the story of the Ottoman Sultans forces us to confront, and they are questions that every generation must answer anew, lest we repeat the mistakes of the past in new and equally devastating forms.